My wife sabotaged my job interview to prevent me from getting a promotion. My dream job was within reach, but I never imagined the person who would destroy that opportunity was the one who was supposed to support me most. My name is Mark, and at 34 years old, I thought my life was finally falling into place. I had been working as a mid-level manager at a tech company for 5 years, putting in long hours and dedicating myself to climbing the corporate ladder. My wife Linda and I had been married for 7 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs like any marriage, I believed we were a team. I never would have guessed that she would become the biggest obstacle in my career path. It started on a Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Exciting opportunity at Nexus Innovations." My heart raced as I opened the email. Nexus Innovations was one of the most prestigious tech firms in the country, known for their cutting-edge projects and exceptional work culture. A former colleague who now worked there had recommended me for a senior management position that had just opened up. The email detailed how they had reviewed my LinkedIn profile and were impressed by my experience and accomplishments. They wanted to schedule an initial video interview with me the following week. I couldn't believe my luck. This was the kind of opportunity I had been working toward my entire career. The position came with a significant salary increase, better benefits, and the chance to work on projects that could genuinely impact the industry. That evening, I shared the news with Linda over dinner. I expected her to be as excited as I was, but her reaction was surprisingly muted. She offered a small smile and said it sounded nice, but immediately changed the subject to something mundane about her day at work. I brushed it off, thinking she might just be tired or distracted. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. I researched Nexus Innovations extensively, prepared answers to potential interview questions, and updated my portfolio with my best work from the past 5 years. Linda seemed to withdraw more as the interview date approached. She would often sigh when I mentioned the opportunity, claiming she was worried about the long hours I might have to work if I got the job. The night before the interview, I asked Linda if she would help me do a mock interview session. She reluctantly agreed, but her heart clearly wasn't in it. She gave short, unenthusiastic responses when I practiced my answers and seemed distracted throughout the entire process. I went to bed that night feeling a mix of excitement and unease, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. The morning of the interview, I woke up early to review my notes one last time. Linda was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She wished me luck, but her eyes held an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. As I was about to leave, she hugged me tightly, almost desperately, and whispered that no matter what happened, we would figure things out together. I found her behavior odd, but attributed it to pre-interview jitters on my part. The interview itself went better than I could have imagined. The hiring manager, a woman named Jennifer, seemed impressed with my background and experience. We connected immediately, discussing industry trends and management philosophies. She asked about my availability to start and mentioned they were hoping to fill the position quickly. I left the video call feeling confident that I had made a strong impression. When I returned home that evening, Linda asked how it went. I enthusiastically shared details about the positive connection I had made with Jennifer and how well I had answered their questions. Linda listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but maintaining that same distant expression she had worn since I first received the email. That night, as we lay in bed, I felt a sense of excitement about what the future might hold, completely unaware that my own wife had already begun plotting to undermine my dreams. The week following my interview with Nexus Innovations was filled with anticipation. Every time my phone buzzed with an email notification, my heart would leap. I checked my inbox obsessively, hoping for good news. Linda seemed to grow more distant with each passing day, often retreating to her home office or finding excuses to run errands when I wanted to discuss the potential job opportunity. 3 days after the interview, I received an email from Jennifer at Nexus Innovations. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, expecting either a job offer or an invitation for a second round of interviews. Instead, the email began with the dreaded words, Thank you for your interest in the senior manager position at Nexus Innovations. My heart sank as I continued reading. Jennifer thanked me for taking the time to interview, but informed me that they had decided to move forward with other candidates. The email was polite but generic, offering no specific feedback about why I wasn't selected. I sat staring at my computer screen, completely baffled by the rejection. The interview had gone so well, and Jennifer had seemed genuinely impressed with my qualifications. I immediately forwarded the email to Linda, expecting a supportive response. When she came home later that evening, she simply patted my shoulder and said that perhaps it wasn't meant to be. Her lack of surprise or disappointment struck me as odd, but I was too consumed by my own feelings of failure to question it further. The next day, I decided to reach out to Jennifer for more specific feedback. I sent a polite email thanking her for the opportunity and asking if she could provide any insights about areas where I might improve for future opportunities. 2 days passed without a response. I tried calling the main office at Nexus Innovations, only to be told that Jennifer was unavailable and that all hiring decisions were final. Frustrated and confused, I contacted my former colleague who had recommended me for the position. I explained what had happened and asked if he had heard anything from the hiring team. He sounded surprised by my rejection and promised to look into it. Later that day, he called me back with puzzling information. According to him, Jennifer had mentioned something about reliability concerns, but wouldn't elaborate further. Reliability concerns? I was floored. In my 5 years at my current company, I had never once been late for work, missed a deadline, or failed to deliver on a commitment. My performance reviews were consistently excellent, with reliability being one of my strongest attributes. Something didn't add up. That evening, I shared this new information with Linda, expecting her to be as outraged as I was. Instead, she seemed uncomfortable, suggesting that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding and that I should just let it go. Her reaction struck me as strange, but I was too caught up in my own disappointment to give it much thought. Over the next few days, I became increasingly obsessed with understanding what had gone wrong. I replayed every moment of the interview in my mind, searching for something I might have said or done that could have raised concerns about my reliability. Nothing came to mind. The interview had been professional, focused entirely on my qualifications and experience. A week after the rejection, I received a call from my former colleague again. He had managed to speak with Jennifer more directly, and what he learned was even more confusing. Apparently, someone had called Nexus Innovations claiming to be a reference from my current company. This person had suggested that while I was talented, I had a tendency to become unreliable when faced with new challenges, sometimes disappearing for days at a time and leaving projects unfinished. I was speechless. None of this was true. I couldn't imagine who would make such claims about me or why. My mind raced through possibilities. A disgruntled former colleague? Someone who was also applying for the position? The theories seemed increasingly far-fetched. When I shared this new development with Linda, her face went pale. She immediately suggested that perhaps my former colleague had misunderstood, or that Jennifer was making excuses for why they had chosen someone else. Her insistence that I drop the matter and move on struck me as increasingly suspicious. Why wouldn't she want me to get to the bottom of such damaging lies about my professional reputation? That night, I lay awake long after Linda had fallen asleep, my mind racing with questions. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. The timing of these mysterious calls, the specific nature of the allegations, Linda's unusual behavior throughout the entire process, it all seemed connected in a way that made my stomach churn. I didn't want to believe what my instincts were telling me, but I knew I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the person who had sabotaged my dream job was much closer to home than I wanted to admit. The following weeks were a haze of confusion and suspicion. I tried to put the Nexus Innovations incident behind me, focusing on my current job and responsibilities. But the unanswered questions lingered like a persistent shadow, coloring my interactions with Linda and casting doubt on the foundation of our marriage. I found myself watching Linda more closely, observing her behaviors and searching for clues that might confirm or deny my growing suspicions. She seemed to go out of her way to be attentive and caring, preparing my favorite meals, suggesting weekend activities we both enjoyed, and even bringing up the possibility of us taking a vacation soon. But her efforts felt strained, almost rehearsed, as if she were trying too hard to convince me that everything was normal. One evening while Linda was in the shower, I found myself drawn to her home office. I had never been particularly interested in her workspace before, but now I felt an inexplicable pull to investigate. Her desk was neat and organized, with a laptop, a few notebooks, and various office supplies arranged in precise order. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. As I was about to leave, my eyes caught sight of her phone bill sitting in a small tray on the corner of her desk. Something compelled me to pick it up. I thumbed through the pages, scanning the list of calls made and received. Most were to familiar numbers, friends, family, her workplace. But then I noticed a series of calls to an unfamiliar number on the day before my interview with Nexus Innovations. The calls had lasted several minutes each, and the timing coincided with when I had been out running errands. My heart began to pound as I took a photo of the phone bill with my own phone. I felt a surge of guilt for snooping, but it was quickly overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. Why would Linda be calling an unknown number repeatedly on that particular day? And why hadn't she mentioned it to me? The next day at work, I found myself unable to focus. The mysterious phone number haunted my thoughts. During my lunch break, I entered the number into a search engine, but found no results. I considered calling the number myself, but hesitated, unsure of what I would say if someone answered. That evening, I decided to approach the situation indirectly. Over dinner, I casually mentioned that I had been thinking about applying for another position that had opened up at a different company. I watched Linda's reaction carefully, noting the subtle tightening of her jaw and the way her fingers gripped her fork. She recovered quickly, offering encouragement, but I had seen enough to confirm my suspicions. Later that night, I lay awake in bed, Linda breathing softly beside me. I knew I needed more concrete evidence before confronting her. The phone calls were suspicious, but they weren't definitive proof of wrongdoing. I needed to find out who she had been talking to and what had been said. The next opportunity came a few days later when Linda mentioned she would be spending the day with her mother, helping with some household repairs. As soon as she left, I returned to her home office, this time with a clear purpose. I sat down at her computer and hesitated for a moment before turning it on. I felt another wave of guilt wash over me, but the need for answers outweighed my discomfort. Linda's computer opened to a password screen. I tried her usual passwords, our anniversary, her mother's birthday, the name of our first pet. None worked. I was about to give up when I remembered a phrase she often used from her favorite movie. I typed it in, and to my surprise, the system unlocked. I spent the next hour going through her emails, browser history, and documents. Most of what I found was mundane: work-related communications, online shopping receipts, correspondence with friends and family. But then I came across her sent folder, where I found an email that made my blood run cold. The email was dated the day before my Nexus Innovations interview. It was addressed to a contact at the company, though the name was unfamiliar. In the email, Linda identified herself as a concerned colleague from my current workplace. She went on to express reservations about my reliability, claiming that while I was talented, I had a history of becoming overwhelmed in high-pressure situations and had left several important projects incomplete. She suggested that Nexus Innovations should reconsider my candidacy, or at least investigate my work history more thoroughly. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling from the betrayal. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. All this time, I had been searching for some external enemy, some rival or disgruntled colleague who might want to sabotage my career. I never imagined that the person responsible was the one I shared my life with, the person who was supposed to be my biggest supporter. As I sat there, processing the devastating discovery, I noticed another email sent a week later. This one was a response from the contact at Nexus Innovations, thanking Linda for her input and informing her that they had decided not to move forward with my candidacy based on the information she had provided. I felt sick to my stomach. The lies Linda had told were directly responsible for me losing the opportunity of a lifetime. But what I couldn't understand was why. What possible reason could she have for wanting to sabotage my success? I quickly printed copies of the emails and restored the computer to its original state, erasing any evidence that I had been there. As I walked out of her office, email printouts in hand, I knew that our marriage would never be the same. The trust we had built over 7 years had been shattered in an instant, replaced by a painful realization that the person I thought I knew so well had been hiding a side of herself I had never seen. The days that followed my discovery were a living nightmare. I moved through our home like a ghost, haunted by the knowledge of Linda's betrayal. Every time she looked at me with those familiar eyes, I saw the stranger who had sabotaged my dreams. Every time she touched me, I flinched internally, remembering the emails that detailed her calculated deception. I kept the printed copies of the emails hidden in my office at work, unable to bring myself to confront Linda immediately. I needed time to process what I had learned, to understand the full extent of her actions before deciding how to respond. Each night, I lay awake beside her, my mind racing with questions. Why had she done it? Was this an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of manipulation? How could she claim to love me while actively working against my success? Linda seemed to sense the growing distance between us. She became increasingly attentive, almost desperate in her efforts to reconnect. She suggested couples counseling, blamed my withdrawal on stress from work, and even proposed renewing our vows on our upcoming anniversary. Each gesture of affection felt like another lie, another layer in the web of deception she had woven around our relationship. 2 weeks after discovering the emails, I finally decided I couldn't continue living in this limbo of unspoken truths. I arranged to work from home on a Friday, telling Linda I had a project that required my full attention. In reality, I needed the time and space to confront her with what I had learned. That morning, I retrieved the email printouts from my office, my hands shaking as I placed them in a folder to bring home. During my commute, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would approach the conversation. But no amount of preparation could have prepared me for the emotional turmoil that awaited me. When I arrived home, Linda was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. She turned to greet me with a smile, her face lighting up at the unexpected sight of me home midweek. I forced a smile in return, my stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. We sat down to eat, making small talk about her plans for the day and updates about her family. Each word felt like a performance, a carefully choreographed dance around the truth that hung between us like a storm cloud waiting to burst. After breakfast, I suggested we sit in the living room to talk. Linda's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her features. She followed me to the couch, sitting close beside me and taking my hand in hers. The warmth of her touch, once a source of comfort, now felt like a violation. I began by asking her if she was happy in our marriage, if there was anything she wanted to discuss, or any concerns she had been hesitant to share. Linda looked confused by the question, assuring me that she was happy and that while every marriage had its challenges, she wouldn't want to be with anyone else. Her words struck me with their irony. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. I reached for the folder I had placed on the coffee table, my hands trembling as I opened it. I slid the printouts across the table, watching Linda's face as her eyes scanned the documents. The color drained from her face as she recognized the emails. Her hands flew to her mouth, a small gasp escaping her lips. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken accusations and revelations. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. She didn't deny writing the emails. Instead, she began to cry, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She tried to explain, her words coming out in disjointed fragments between gasps for air. As I listened to her explanation, a picture began to form, one of insecurity, fear, and misguided attempts to control what she saw as an uncertain future. Linda admitted that she had been terrified that if I got the job at Nexus Innovations, everything would change. She worried that I would become more confident, more successful, and ultimately realized that I no longer needed her. She spoke of her own insecurities, how she had always felt like the less successful partner in our relationship. She described her fear that my promotion would widen the gap between us, that I would meet new people, have new experiences, and eventually leave her for someone who she perceived as more accomplished or more suited to my new status. In her twisted logic, sabotaging my interview had been an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to maintain the status quo and keep our relationship exactly as it was. She never considered that her actions would destroy the very foundation of our marriage, that her fear of losing me would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. As I sat there, listening to her tearful confession, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger at her betrayal, pity for her insecurity, and a profound sense of loss for the relationship we had once shared. The woman sitting beside me, crying and begging for forgiveness, was both the wife I had loved for 7 years and a stranger I had never truly known. The confrontation left both of us emotionally drained. Linda's confession hung in the air of our living room, a heavy presence that seemed to absorb all the oxygen. I remained silent for what felt like an eternity, processing the magnitude of what she had admitted. The woman I had built a life with, the person I trusted implicitly, had deliberately sabotaged my career out of fear and insecurity. Linda continued to cry, her words tumbling out in a desperate stream of explanations and apologies. She promised she would do anything to make things right, to earn back my trust. She suggested we could find another opportunity like Nexus Innovations, that she would help me search for even better positions, that she would personally call companies to explain what had happened. But her offers of help only highlighted the depth of her misunderstanding. This wasn't just about a job opportunity, it was about the fundamental breach of trust that had occurred. How could I ever trust her again, knowing that she would act against my interests when she felt threatened or insecure? I finally found my voice, asking her how long she had been feeling this way. If there were other instances where she had undermined me without my knowledge. Linda hesitated, her eyes darting away from mine. She admitted that she had occasionally downplayed my achievements when talking with friends and family, always framing them in a way that made her feel more secure in our relationship. She confessed to feeling a constant gnawing fear that I would eventually outgrow her and leave. As I listened, a pattern began to emerge, subtle manipulations disguised as support, backhanded compliments presented as encouragement, and a persistent narrative that kept me positioned as someone who needed her guidance and approval. I had been so focused on my career goals that I had failed to see the ways in which she had been working to maintain a power imbalance in our relationship. The rest of that day passed in a blur of painful conversations and tearful revelations. We moved from the living room to our bedroom, then to the kitchen, each space now tainted with the memory of our confrontation. Linda oscillated between defensive justification and desperate remorse, while I struggled to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the one who had deliberately sabotaged my dreams. As evening approached, I suggested we take some time apart to process what had happened. Linda reluctantly agreed to stay with her mother for the weekend, giving us both space to think. As she packed a small bag, I watched her movements, noticing details I had never paid attention to before. The way she bit her lip when she was nervous, how her hands trembled slightly as she folded her clothes, the defeated slump of her shoulders. The moment the front door closed behind her, the silence of our home felt both liberating and suffocating. I walked through each room, seeing our shared life through a new lens. The photos on the walls, the furniture we had chosen together, the small objects that represented our journey as a couple, everything now seemed tainted by Linda's betrayal. I spent that night in a state of emotional paralysis, unable to sleep yet too exhausted to do anything but lie in bed and stare at the ceiling. My mind replayed moments from our relationship, searching for clues I had missed, signs of her insecurity that I had overlooked or dismissed. Each memory was now suspect, each shared experience potentially colored by her hidden agenda. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity that had been absent the day before. The initial shock had given way to a more measured understanding of what needed to happen next. I knew that our marriage, as it had existed, was over. The trust that forms the foundation of any partnership had been irrevocably broken. The question now was whether anything could be built from the rubble that remained. I spent the day making a list of pros and cons, trying to logically evaluate whether our relationship was worth saving. On one side, I listed our shared history, the good times we had experienced, the ways in which we had supported each other through various challenges. On the other, I cataloged Linda's betrayal, the pattern of manipulation it revealed, and the fundamental incompatibility of our values and aspirations. By Sunday evening, when Linda was due to return, I had reached a decision. I didn't know what the future would hold for us individually or as a couple, but I knew that we couldn't continue as we had been. Something fundamental needed to change, either in the structure of our relationship or in our status as partners. When Linda walked through the door, her eyes red from crying, she looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. I invited her to sit with me in the living room, the same space where our confrontation had taken place 2 days earlier. I explained that while I understood her fears and insecurities, I couldn't move forward without addressing the fundamental breach of trust that had occurred. I suggested that we enter couples counseling, not with the goal of returning to what we had before, but to determine whether a new kind of relationship could be built from the ashes of the old one. I made it clear that this would require complete honesty from both of us, a willingness to examine the power dynamics in our relationship, and a commitment to personal growth regardless of the outcome. Linda agreed immediately, her relief palpable. We spent the rest of the evening researching therapists and making our first appointment for the following week. As we sat together on the couch, scrolling through therapist profiles on my laptop, there was a fragile sense of possibility between us. Not a return to what we had, but perhaps the beginning of something new and more honest. That night, as we lay in bed facing opposite directions, I felt a strange mix of grief and hope. I was mourning the death of the marriage I thought I had, while simultaneously wondering what might rise from its ashes. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with uncomfortable conversations and painful realizations. But for the first time since discovering Linda's betrayal, I felt a glimmer of agency, a sense that whatever happened next, it would be based on truth rather than deception. The first few weeks of therapy were challenging, to say the least. Dr. Harris, our counselor, created a safe space for us to explore the underlying issues that had led to Linda's betrayal. She was patient but firm, guiding us through difficult conversations and helping us unpack years of unspoken fears and resentments. I learned that Linda's insecurity stemmed from her childhood, where she had constantly been compared unfavorably to her more accomplished older sister. This pattern had continued into her adult relationships, where she often felt like the less successful partner. Her actions, while inexcusable, had been driven by a deep-seated fear of abandonment that she had never addressed. For my part, I came to realize that I had been somewhat oblivious to Linda's emotional needs. So focused on my career goals, I had failed to notice the signs of her growing insecurity. I had interpreted her occasional criticisms as constructive feedback rather than expressions of her own fears. I had been so caught up in my own ambitions that I hadn't taken the time to truly understand her perspective. These revelations didn't excuse Linda's behavior, but they did provide context that helped me make sense of what had happened. The betrayal wasn't about me personally. It was about Linda's unresolved issues and her misguided attempts to protect herself from what she perceived as an inevitable abandonment. As the weeks turned into months, we slowly began to rebuild our relationship on a more honest foundation. Linda took individual therapy to address her insecurities, while I worked on becoming more emotionally attuned to her needs. We established new patterns of communication, setting aside time each week to check in about our feelings and concerns.
Professionally, I had to decide how to move forward regarding my career. The position at Nexus Innovations was no longer available, but the experience had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of trust and transparency in all aspects of life. I began exploring other opportunities, this time with a clearer understanding of what I wanted not just in my career, but in my life as a whole. 6 months after the confrontation, I received an unexpected email from Jennifer at Nexus Innovations. She had heard through the grapevine about what had happened and wanted to apologize for not investigating the claims against me more thoroughly. She explained that they had since discovered that Linda was not who she claimed to be, and she wanted to know if I would be interested in interviewing for a new position that had opened up. I forwarded the email to Linda without comment, a small test of the new honesty we were trying to build between us. When I came home that evening, she mentioned the email, her expression a mixture of apprehension and hope. We talked about what it would mean for our relationship if I took the job, acknowledging both the opportunities and challenges it would present. In the end, I decided to interview for the position, but with a new perspective on what success meant to me. I went through the interview process with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from self-awareness. When they offered me the job, I negotiated terms that would allow for work-life balance, recognizing that a successful career meant nothing without a healthy personal life to support it. My first day at Nexus Innovations marked a new beginning not just professionally, but personally as well. Linda and I had decided to stay together, but our relationship had transformed. We were more honest with each other, more willing to address issues as they arose rather than letting them fester beneath the surface. The trust between us was still fragile, but it was being rebuilt deliberately and consciously. A year after discovering Linda's betrayal, I found myself reflecting on how much it changed. I was thriving in my new role at Nexus Innovations, leading a team that was working on innovative projects that challenged and fulfilled me. Linda had started her own business, a small bakery that combined her passion for baking with her desire for financial independence. Our marriage was different now, less about the fairy tale romance we had once imagined, and more about the practical work of two committed individuals supporting each other's growth while maintaining their own identities. There were still moments of insecurity, times when old fears resurfaced, but we now had the tools to address them honestly rather than resorting to destructive behaviors. Looking back, I could see how Linda's betrayal, as painful as it had been, had ultimately forced both of us to confront issues we had been avoiding. It had shattered the illusion of the perfect relationship we thought we had, replacing it with something more authentic and resilient. I never would have chosen this path for us, but I had come to understand that sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most profound growth. The dream job I thought I had lost had eventually become mine, but more importantly, the relationship I thought I had lost had been transformed into something more honest and meaningful. As I sat in my office at Nexus Innovations, looking out at the city skyline, I felt a sense of gratitude for how far we had come. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future, both my own and ours as a couple. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed us had ultimately become the catalyst for a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other, a foundation upon which we could build something more lasting and true. I never would have chosen this path for us, but I had come to understand that sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most profound growth. The dream job I thought I had lost had eventually become mine, but more importantly, the relationship I thought I had lost had been transformed into something more honest and meaningful. As I sat in my office at Nexus Innovations, looking out at the city skyline, I felt a sense of gratitude for how far we had come. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future, both my own and ours as a couple. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed us had ultimately become the catalyst for a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other, a foundation upon which we could build something more lasting and true.